Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Chris Hernandez-Roy, and I'm the Deputy Director and Senior Fellow of the Americas Program at CSIS. Thank you for joining us today for a conversation with Rear Admiral Larry LeGree, Deputy Director of the Joint Interagency Task Force South. The illicit drug trade poses a significant threat not only to production in transit countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, but also to the national security of the United States. The extent to which transnational drug trafficking extends irrespective of borders creates a myriad of problems that call for a robust and unified response. The impact of the drug trade on the United States is multifaceted. The abuse of illicit drugs has sparked a public health crisis, devastating countless lives and communities and straining the healthcare system. It sparks violence, contaminates the financial system with illicit funds, and overburdens the justice system. In production and transit countries throughout Latin America, it leaves a wake of violence, corruption, and instability, which can threaten the very democratic governance of a country. Destination countries for cocaine in Europe have experienced dramatic and unprecedented levels of violence. In this context, transnational criminal organizations have evolved, diversifying their operations and expanding their influence. Criminal groups like Mexican cartels, Albanian and Italian mafias, to mention a few, that had vied for dominance over cocaine trafficking hubs and market access, have now turned to activities such as illegal mining, wildlife trafficking, and trafficking of illegal firearms and of persons. The rapid pace at which these criminal organizations operate demands an equally swift and coordinated response from international partners committed to combating crime. While they are not sufficient just on their own, strong interdiction capabilities and intelligence sharing among partner countries not only enhances the efficiency of law enforcement operations, but also builds the trust essential for sustained international cooperation. An exemplary model of such cooperation is the Joint Interagency Task Force South, JIATF-South as it's known. This international interagency task force embodies the principles of centralized information sharing and collaborative action. By pooling resources and intelligence from multiple countries and agencies, JIATF-South enhances the U.S. and its partners' collective ability to disrupt the flow of illicit drugs and address complex transnational threats. For this reason, we are very pleased today to be joined by Rear Admiral Larry LeGree, Deputy Director of the Joint Interagency Task Force South. Admiral LeGree has served as the principal military assistant to the Secretary of Defense, James Mattis, and more recently served as Senior Nuclear Advisor to the Secretary of Energy. Admiral LeGree has commanded the Asadabad Provincial Reconstruction Team in Kunar Province, Afghanistan, and is a recipient of the Defense Superior Service Medal, Legion of Merit, Bronze Star, among other service medals and unit awards. He's a proud graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy and holds a Master in International Public Policy from the Elliott School of International Affairs of George Washington University and a master's degree in Public Administration and Political Science from the North Carolina State University. Admiral LeGree is also a National Security Fellow of the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Admiral LeGree, thank you so much for joining us today.
Chris, thanks. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I would just like to start by saying that I have great respect for the work that the Americas program here does at CSIS. You have produced some wonderful work that we use all the time down there in JIATF.
That's great to hear. It's good that somebody's reading our work. Thank you, Admiral.
Yep.
There's a great report, speaking of work, by another institution, the National Defense University, entitled JIATF-South, The Best Known, Least Understood Interagency Success. Can you begin by explaining the structure of your organization and its overarching goals, I should say, in counter-narcotics operations? And in what context did JIATF-South emerge?
Sure. I'll start with a context question first. This organization, as a joint task force, has been around for quite a while. Generally, when a task force is stood up, it has a set purpose, it has a sunset, and it will form up and form down as necessary. We wish that were the case, but we're fighting a wicked problem here, which is drugs. And so we haven't found the end of that mission yet. The report you referred to, that's a great report. It was written, I believe, in 2014. I'm actually familiar with it because when I was doing a fellowship up there at the Kennedy School, one of the projects I was working on was, at that point, we were really looking, how do we capture many of the successes we've had in interagency cooperation as we move forward. We thought maybe we were sunsetting some of those conflicts. And of course, we came across this great report done in 2014, and it was Dr. Lamb about the JIATF-South. So it's really coincidental and fortuitous that now I get a chance to work in that organization and see how this unique structure works. You know, the title Joint Interagency Task Force, it only has one I, interagency. We actually have talked about maybe putting a second I in there because, as you alluded to, it is very international as well. And we have over 20 partner nations that are completely integrated into our operations on a daily basis down there in Key West, Florida.
Which I was very pleased to visit back in March. It's a really great installation. JIATF, which is now the way I'm going to pronounce it, which is the correct way, sorry for the JIATF, is often referred to as the interagency gold standard. How is the interagency process different in JIATF than in other contexts, and what are some of the best practices that you've noticed?
Sure. Well, I kind of almost have to pull it back to our mission, right? Because, you know, I'm wearing a uniform today. I represent the Department of Defense. In our nation, the Department of Defense does not do domestic law enforcement. At its root, going after drugs is a law enforcement function, right? So we have kind of squared the circle on that with the authorities that we operate down there, and it's an interagency solution. So when you were visiting down there in Key West, you know, there's the big buoy down there where all the tourists go, and they think that's the southernmost part of the United States. In fact, there's a little plaque there that says, actually the southernmost part of the United States is on the other side of a fence, and that's where JIATF is. And for very good reasons, we hold the southernmost geography in the United States, and we kind of work behind the big fence there, doing work with all of our intelligence partners, many of our law enforcement partners, and our international partners. And we're all thrown together in this facility far from the flagpole of Washington, D.C., where we can really work together. Now, when I was studying that report that the National Defense University had done 10 years ago, had lots of thoughts and ideas about how do you actually make organizations that have different objectives, different funding, you know, different nationalities, different authorities all work together. And some of the things that we posited back there have been true, but I've really developed a lot more depth on that. I would say that it's a very unifying mission for one. The going after drugs is something that affects the average American on the average day, right? So every organization may have different objectives, but to some degree, it's a really common unifying mission. The structure is interesting because, you know, what we're really good at is sometimes the big stuff. We're really good at logistics. We're really good at planning. We're really good at communications and command and control. And we have vessels and ships that can go long distances out at sea. What we don't have a lot of experience with is, you know, law enforcement, things like that. So the melding of them is really powerful. Now, there's a really fundamental part of our mission that's important to understand because it kind of gets to how we work. So as the JIATF-South Deputy Director, we're responsible for the detection and monitoring of narcotics going to the United States. Okay, detection and monitoring. But if you see on the pictures behind here, that looks like an awful lot of interdiction, right? What you're seeing is the way we hand it off to our law enforcement partners. So we use a lot of the things that the military is really good at. And then what we do is we have a transition to our law enforcement partners or our partner nation law enforcement forces to actually do an interdiction at sea. And, you know, perfect example of this, when I was a couple years ago, I was a young lieutenant on a destroyer out of San Diego. We just got back from deployment to the Middle East. And we had a little bit of time in our schedule where we'd been getting some maintenance done, but we wanted to get out and kind of knock the rust off a bit, literally. So we did a 6 or 7 week deployment supporting a JIATF-South mission. Now, what a Navy ship can do is you can go way outside the Galapagos Islands, for example. That's really hard to do for a lot of other nations because that's a long way, right? And so we were working with the Coast Guard, and on board the ship, we had a Coast Guard lieutenant and a team of about 10 people, a law enforcement detachment, we call them leadettes, and they were attached to the ship. And when we were getting ready to go after a drug smuggler, literally at the final moments, and generally this was like 3 in the morning, you know, we'd sneak up on them with our big ship with all the lights off in the fog. We would literally call up to the Coast Guard headquarters, via the JIATF, from JIATF over to the Coast Guard, and we would do a formal tactical control shift, and we would actually haul down the Navy flag and we would haul up a Coast Guard flag. And that's important because now you've transitioned from that world of military stuff into the world of law enforcement, right? And then all of a sudden this giant Navy warship with all the sailors on board, we're working for that Coast Guard lieutenant, right? And that Coast Guard lieutenant ended up getting, at the time it was there was one fishing vessel that had about 8 metric tons of cocaine on it, and at the time it was the 4th largest seizure in law enforcement history. And it was a powerful way to see that happen.
So we've talked about, or we've mentioned that it's an interagency organization, but you've also said they're international partners and partner countries. Can you explain that international dimension?
Sure. So we have resident inside our building is we have foreign liaison officers from over 20 nations, and that includes European partners as well, from the Caribbean, from South America, and from Latin America. Exclusively, these officers are very high capacity, very successful within their own services. And a posting to JIATF-South is considered a very important job for people who are going to be future leaders in their own service. For example, recently the former Chief of Naval Operations of the Colombian Navy had served at JIATF. The point of that is these are people who are plugged into their own organizations. And as we work interdictions at sea, it's a really big ocean, and there's simply not enough resources for the U.S. Navy or the U.S. Coast Guard alone, and there never will be. So it's aligned incentives with these officers. They work there. They're part of our daily operations, and they're very well supported from their nations.
You said it's a very big ocean. Can you give us an idea of sort of the area of operation? Because I think in the popular imagination, people think of interdicting fast boats off of Miami or maybe in the Gulf, but this is a much bigger thing we're talking about.
My goodness, yes. Our area of operations is 42 million square miles. So all of South America and all the ocean around it, about a third of the way across the Pacific, most of the way across the Atlantic Ocean, just south of, or just shy of Cape Verde, and quite a bit north. So it's a really big ocean. That's right. Yep.
A lot of water. A lot's changed since the early days when marijuana was really the primary illicit drug that was trafficked. We've seen the rise of cocaine in the 80s and 90s, and cocaine remains a very important commodity. In fact, to Europe, it's increasing. But now we're also seeing synthetic drugs, other things. As the trade has changed, how has JIATF evolved since its founding in the late 80s?
Great. Yeah, that's a great question. Because I will start that by saying we have an agile adversary that's always changing, right? And the commodities are always changing. So we have to be agile as well, and we always have to be looking to change and adapt. We get an awful lot of cocaine off the water and off the air, and we enable a lot of cocaine seizures in ports and with partners. We are not solely, it's a lot more than just cocaine on deck for us, however. We really focus our targeting efforts on that one because cocaine is such a high commodity markup that we think of it as the cash cow. It's what feeds the illicit networks that lie behind almost all of the nefarious activity that happens in Latin America, in Central America, in South America, and increasingly in Europe. So for us that's basically it's a go after the money type of thing. So we go with lots of cocaine. That said, what has really changed is, back when JIATF was formed in 1989, cocaine was going south to north to Miami. There was a lot of marijuana, as you mentioned, and it wasn't as sophisticated routes, right? That's kind of why we were out in Key West. Since then, the world is globalized, right? And globalization it really has multiple aspects. It's, you tend to think of globalization as container ships at sea bringing commodities in. Globalization is also the movement of people, and that has affected the drug trade, and certainly the movement of money as well and financial flows. So for us to remain relevant, for us to remain an organization that's at the front edge of getting after this, we have to be facile. We have to be able to compete in all of these areas of movement of money, movement of people and ships and commodities. So that's really changed.
Yeah, you've mentioned, we both mentioned Europe. CSIS has done some work on looking at transatlantic drug flows, particularly cocaine from producing countries in the Andes, through the Caribbean, and across to Europe. How has this influenced your operations? Is there a more pronounced effort to cooperate with Europe to address that?
Right. I mean, we're fighting a global problem here, right? So we have to have a reach across the Atlantic, and we have to particularly be attuned to that. We have 4 foreign liaison officers and 2 task force or task groups, that are integrated already into our command structure. But Europe is it's a fascinating, interesting problem, right? So there was a time when I would perhaps be questioned by someone who's writing budgets up here in this town, like, hey, why are you paying attention to what's going to Europe? Okay, once again, that's a little bit of a failure to understand how globalization actually works. If I have a container of bananas in Guayaquil, Ecuador, that might be going to Antwerp, for example. Okay, that doesn't mean it's stopping in Antwerp. It could be going to Singapore. It could very well be coming to Long Island. I'll talk to DEA agents on the East Coast, the big East Coast ports, and they'll say, we have all kinds of drugs coming in from the ports of Europe. In other words, the first order to the United States is really not reflective of the fact that it's a global network we're fighting, right? So as we've really enhanced our relationships with Europe, it's been important. Europe is a growing market as well, and not just for cocaine, but for fentanyl. Fentanyl kind of started here in the United States because we had a population predisposed to it based on the opioid overdoses and overprescriptions. All my colleagues I talk to in Europe know it's coming there too, right? And that's a different and hard problem for fentanyl. But for cocaine, the market's analogous in scale to that of the United States. It's a large market, and frankly, a lot of the interdiction efforts of our law enforcement partners and what the type of work we do at JIATF has made the United States a bit more of a hard target. The economics of this really will tell you where it's easier to buy stuff. So we see Europe has softer interdiction at the moment, and their law enforcement regimes are not as strict. So in some degrees, it's an easier path for flow of cocaine, that is, to go to Europe. Now, here's an important distinction I kind of want to talk about a little bit, is when you look at a map with the arrows of all the places drugs are flowing, it's very easy to look at that as a commodity going one direction, right? But there's always something coming back, and that's the point. There's always something coming back. It could be trade-based type of exchanges. We've had examples of millions of dollars worth of Chinese cigarettes, for example. Generally, it's money, okay? And you mentioned it in your opening, what the cocaine leaving, what that really fuels is the finances and things that lend to instability in this hemisphere coming back and fueling that instability.
Yeah, the financial corruption and penetrating
exactly right. Yes.
legitimate businesses.
Right.
I was not going to ask you this, but since you raised it, I will. You mentioned fentanyl. And I think most of us who think about fentanyl see it as coming across from Mexico into the United States, primarily across the land border. Is this something you're seeing in your interdiction efforts at sea?
Not yet, not at scale anyway. It's a fundamentally different type of problem because of the size of the compounds. So we don't have the ability to necessarily focus per se on fentanyl interdictions because these are multi-use type of commodities that come in. If anything, the regimes that the U.S. government has at its disposal to get after these types of products, it's almost more in some of the nuclear regimes that we've had in the past, where you have dual-use type of equipment and you have to have equipment suppliers and things like that registered. It's a fundamentally different problem. That said, of course, it's a pernicious problem. Now, where our ability to really affect and help with that is in the fact that it's the networks. And I mentioned earlier, it's all about the networks. Okay, the same networks that are going to be moving cocaine, that are going to be involved in illegal threat finance, they're going to be supporting nefarious activities, are generally the same networks that are also going to be involved with fentanyl.
You mentioned the U.S. becoming a hard target or harder target, and that's one of the reasons why cocaine is going to Europe. At the same time, for instance, Colombia has done a lot to improve the patrolling of its waters and its efforts. And to a great extent, that's led cocaine to be trafficked from Colombia, but not out of Colombia directly by sea, but to neighboring countries particularly through Venezuela, and now increasingly through Ecuador. So as targets get hardened, the traffickers, they adapt quickly and they find new routes. I hear that Guyana, Suriname is becoming increasingly important. We've heard a lot in the news about Ecuador. The Paraná-Paraguay canal in the south of South America is also becoming increasingly important. How are you adapting to all these, new modalities or new geographic locations from which the traffickers are applying their trade?
That's a great question. I could spend an hour on this one, but I'll hit a couple of those topics. First of all, there's a very nice piece that your organization did here on Ecuador, and I think it was Center of the Storm. Is I call that right? Yeah, that was a good piece, and it really shows the challenges of doing this, right? So what you kind of loosely described is what we call the balloon effect, which is we squeeze a balloon down somewhere, it's going to pop up somewhere else. Okay, that's our bread and butter. When our organization as a joint task force gets too set in our ways with one particular focus area, it's going to go somewhere else. I got to go to Harvard, so I learned all about some logic and things like that. And one of them is this Derridian form of logic, which is you look for what's not there, not what's there, right? Or you look for where are the holes, where are the black spots, where are the gray things, right? And so we're constantly doing that. And I would say that what you described of a vector of flow through from Venezuela, for Colombia through Venezuela to Guyana and Suriname is one of those places. We know that there's significant amount of flow going into Suriname and Guyana. Those nations are perfect examples of places where the influence of cocaine has underwritten so much governance, so much institutional capacity, and contributed to corruption that your hands are really tied for on-the-ground enforcement. Now that couples with the fact that in Suriname, about a decade ago, a series of arrests and imprisonments in the U.S. system led to our law enforcement partners being evicted from the country, frankly, right? So all of those relationships you have and the ability to get after it, we really ceded that space to the networks and the cartels.
Yeah, it probably didn't help that the president's son was indicted for...
And still serving time.
Yeah, exactly.
That's right, that's correct. Yes, so...
of Suriname.
Of Suriname, that's correct, yes. So it's a really challenging problem, but it's because they're a throughput, there's still places we can get after, right? So we think that a significant part of that flow, which is on the order of hundreds and hundreds of metric tons, we're talking billions of dollars of cocaine, is a primary throughput to Europe right now. Yeah. A lot of it's going on commercial aircraft to some degree with mules. A lot of it's going on offshore vessels that then you'll have small vessels like sailboats and semi-submersibles actually go all the way across the Atlantic Ocean.
I'm going to ask you about that later.
Okay, we'll come back to that. It's fascinating, right? And then you also have a problem that your CSIS report, Bridges and Barriers, really highlighted really an important point, is that Europe is in the Caribbean, right? And Guyana and Suriname specifically are nations that identify as Caribbean nations. But so, for example, French Guyana. When you enter French Guyana, you are in France, okay? So when you think about customs regimes and places where you can potentially get interdictions, you're already there. I was speaking at a MAOC sponsored conference, which is a Maritime Analysis Operations Center, a partner organization of ours. I was speaking at a conference 7 or 8 months ago to a very European crowd, and I know I had some French colleagues in there, and I made the following statement, frankly intending to be a little bit provocative, but inducing some action. I wanted to see what would happen. And I said, in front of a crowd of 100 people, I said the most porous border in Europe for the drug flow right now is the river between Suriname and French Guyana. I received no pushback on that. My French colleagues were like, yeah. So many elements to your question, but one of the important things is what we're uniquely positioned with at JIATF is because we already have fulsome relationships with our European partners and our foreign liaison officers who work there, we are engaged with the Dutch, who have a historic colonial relationship with Suriname, right? We are involved with nations, with the French, and we have a French liaison officer. So we're able to not just look at this as a U.S. solution. Europe cares about this. I think as people watch the pending upcoming elections in Suriname, there's great interest, and I anticipate that the Dutch government will do their version of getting more law enforcement folks back in the country.
You mentioned MAOC, which is actually going to be my next question, the European Maritime Analysis and Operations Center, which is based in Lisbon. And for lay audience seems to be something similar, but with important differences to JIATF, excuse me. Can you tell us a little bit about your cooperation with MAUC, but also like what are the differences in approaches between the two? And also you're working with UNODC, you're working with Frontex, you're working I think directly with some of the European law enforcement organizations.
Correct.
Tell us a little bit about how that works.
Yeah, I'll frame broadly. This is, as we mentioned, you have to fight a network with a network. So that is kind of our secret sauce. We're good at working with other nations and other networks. The Maritime Analysis and Operations Center specifically in Lisbon, it's an EC-based organization, European community-based, funded by them. It was, for years, it was 7 nations. Interestingly, Belgium just joined or is about to in Germany as well. And that's particularly important with Belgium because a significant amount of container trade, on the order of 40% of cocaine that's heading in containers, we think it's probably going to Antwerp on an order, right? So fantastic. There's some fundamental differences. We tend to do more of the intelligence cycle work that's associated with the entire cycle. But what the MAOC is really good at doing is coordinating on European assets, and if they have something that's coming across the Atlantic, they'll say who's best positioned to get it. And so they'll talk to the French Navy, and the French are right there, and they'll say we can get a ship out for it. Or maybe they'll talk to the Spanish or Spanish National Police or Guardia Civil, which is a very effective organization that we work very closely with. And just to kind of give you a flavor of our links to Europe, the airport of Madrid is where about 70% of flights that originate from South America first hit Europe. And Guardia Civil has a very effective organization there to find a lot of people, because there was a day when 20 to 30% of people on these flights were muling cocaine. They have a very effective organization and intelligence targeting process there that's really kind of, we think to some degree, really inhibited that. The current director of operations for Guardia Civil in Madrid was a foreign liaison officer at JIATF-South.
JIATF, yeah.
So it's these are the types of things that, with a long-standing trust relationships, that it really helps the ability to form a network.
Interesting. As the nature of illicit drugs has evolved, so have the tactics. We've talked about the balloon effect, but the tactics have also changed. The tactics used by criminal organizations, and I'm thinking particularly about technology. What's their level of use of new technology? How is that potentially making their activity more effective?
You've hit on a great point, because if I have an unlimited budget, I can buy anything in the world. The cartel uses the latest and greatest technology. Absolutely. We have had to mirror that. JIATF is a technology organization as well, or we're going to get left behind, and is constantly evolving. You think about even what we see in the conflict in Ukraine right now with the use of Starlink, things like that. Things are always changing. The other kind of structural thing that has evolved is what we would call more of a federated approach to commodities and shipping. It's almost like some of the things we're really good at, which is like logistics. It's almost like their logistics network have evolved as well. There's not if you look at the Netflix documentaries, you think it's all about a cartel moving stuff. Well, the cartel moves stuff to the next person who moves it, to the next person who moves it, to the next person who moves it, right? And so that's that federation of distribution. It's almost it's a new evolution of the model by which the cartels are pushing drugs to wherever the market will bear.
And presumably it's a series of links in a chain, and therefore if you just take out one chain, while it may interrupt something temporarily, that chain is quickly replaced by another one of these smaller groups that just fills it in.
Exactly. It's a resiliency model that lots of that network organizations tend to have, right? There's multiple ways to do that.
So technology, and this is something I've been really meaning to ask you, narco subs. We used a picture on one of our reports. We find them really quite fascinating. And they seem to show the fact that, significant sophistication of these organizations. You can't just, whip one up from scratch. Yeah. So, how good are these things, and how, and more importantly, how good are they at evading detection?
Yeah, so it's a hard problem. Even on with a regular vessel, the ocean is so big, and if you spend your life there, you kind of understand that it can be hard to find just a regular vessel. A vessel with a low silhouette with just a snorkel sticking up, that's a really hard problem. We do have quite a bit of success with these. There's one right there. Yep. Matter of fact, we have one that we brought back to headquarters sitting in front of our building. These vessels they tend to take pretty large loads, generally as much as 3 metric tons of cocaine. And as a naval officer who spent my life at sea, I can appreciate the challenges of going across the ocean in something like this with weather and waves. These vessels aren't built to our kind of safety standards. Yeah. They have problems on occasion. But I'll tell you that we have pretty good success. We do pretty well against these.
You mentioned the Guardia Civil. This is one of your partner organizations, and this is, I believe, this is a photograph of a narco sub that was intercepted in Cadiz a few years ago. Yeah. So clearly, your mandate is to go after drugs, right? But as you yourself said, the ships go one direction and they're bringing something back. Criminal groups are trafficking in all sorts of commodities these days, not just drugs. They're trafficking in weapons, they're trafficking in illegal wildlife, they're trafficking in contraband, you mentioned cigarettes, they're even trafficking in people. So your mandate is counter narcotics. Can you go after some of these other illegal commodities? Sure. And if you can't, perhaps you could explain why not.
Well, it goes a little bit back to how I laid the groundwork with the Department of Defense as a Title X organization. We don't arrest people. But with the partnerships we have, that's the real power of JIATF. So if we find something that's not cocaine related, but say it's weapons related or something like that, we have the ability, and we do this all the time, to turn it over to someone who can do it, right? And we have, there's a program that we've actually made quite a bit of progress with. We call it multi-threat domain awareness. And it's a domain awareness tool that really lets you see that we're looking for cocaine, but hey, we happen to find this, or we happen to find that. We find this all the time, right? This is guns. The relevance of that too is also when we provide access to nations, because we have congruent interest in doing things, right? Now, if I go into Trinidad and Tobago, I'm not sure which nation this was. This was Maria, this was Samar, this is Mexico. I was just in Guadalajara about a month ago. When I go there, if I sit down with their leadership and I talk about cocaine problems, they look at me and say, yeah, that's your cocaine problem. We care about guns. We care about this. We care about that, right? So having the ability to pass to partners information that's helpful to their interests is really kind of what helps the interagency and the international process work so well, because everyone has an alignment of interest when it comes to illicit activities. So it goes back to what I talked about. If you just look at it as a vector of what's going, the real art is understanding what's coming back, what that's doing to destabilize that nation, what that's doing to add to violence, corruption, and instability in that nation. And shame on us if we don't have the type of partnerships established with mature partners who can action those things, that when we see something that's outside of our immediate remit, like guns, like human trafficking, like a different type of commodity or financial flow, that we don't have the right partnerships to turn that over to. That's why when you come down, if you sit in the conference room at JIATF-South and you look at all of on the wall, the plaques from the organizations we work with, it's a dizzying amount of organizations, and every one of those is a relationship that we have. In some case, trust, built it long, and it's just been a long habit. In some case, it's a digital relationship, but it's all there.
Yeah. You've mentioned the size of the ocean, and I imagine that going after some of these narco subs or fast boats that are driven, that are part of the transnational organized crime, that it's like looking for a needle in a haystack. I've heard that JIATF interdicts about 10% of what might be coming into the United States. Maybe you can tell me that's not accurate. If it is accurate, how do we get to 2, 3, 4 times that in terms of interdiction?
Yeah, I mean, to some degree, that's a resource question because it is a big ocean, and there's not enough ships in our Navy or our Coast Guard or anyone's Navy to put a type of patrol down. So there's a couple answers to that. One of which is we have to continue to optimize our relationships with our partner nations, and that's a very fulsome relationship. This particular last cycle, about 80% of our interdictions at sea were done by partner nations. 5 or 6 years ago, that number was probably about 35%. So we've optimized this organization to do that. There's a lot of new technology out there that we are also engaged with to do large-scale maritime domain awareness, ISR type assets. So we have to explore all those things. There's a counterpart to that. We think 10% is probably about it. Of 10% of the cocaine that's coming out that we're able to interdict with our partners. But the problem with this is you never quite know what the denominator is. You never get that assurity. Now, what we do know is, and this actually the NDU report back 10 years ago maintains a consistent number, is JIATF counts probably 10% of all of the cocaine coming out of Colombia, but we account for about 40%, give or take, of all of the interdictions that happen in the entire world for cocaine. When you aggregate all of the law enforcement activities and stuff like that. So we try to hurt them in the source zone. I can always use more ships. I can always use more aircraft. I fully understand the resources of what my Navy and our Coast Guard and our partner nations have to do. And ships are hard to keep at sea.
And they're expensive.
Right? Yeah. But so is this.
Right.
Yep.
I don't know if you're able to share this with us or not. It's fine if you're not, but I was just wondering if you could give us an idea of, we've talked about tonnage in terms of, so many tons of cocaine that you're interdicting. We've talked about percentages. Can you give us an idea generally of, on any given day, how many assets the bad guys have that are trying to get to the United States?
I can broadly give you that. There's roughly 25 to 30 major movements happening
daily
on a daily basis. Yeah. Right? Yeah. The UNODC does a really good job of kind of cataloging how much coca production is happening. Largely Peru, Bolivia, and Colombia. Right. And so you can kind of that becomes your input function where okay, this much is being produced, and it's all going somewhere. Now what's also happened with coca production is it's gone up. And like any farming technique that has better technology, better use of farmers and land use, the yields continue to go up too. So JIATF continues to set records of year after year, we're getting a little more off the water, and yet we're doing that with less assets. Last year, we're down about 18.8% air hours and about 25% ship days. So yet we still set an interdiction record. I would like to think we're just getting better and better all the time, but the fact is there's more cocaine out there. Mm-hmm. Right. And
when you mention those interdictions, are you talking about just U.S. assets or including partner nations?
That's partner nations. Right. That's right, yep.
Mm-hmm. A minute ago you mentioned that in the past, U.S. assets were responsible for the majority of the interdictions and partner nations maybe only about 20%. That's as far as I understand, that's kind of switched in the last few years. You've already mentioned resource constraints and stuff, so maybe looking at it from the positive angle, what does this say about partner nations' capabilities?
Absolutely, yes, that's a great question. It's, for one, it reflects long-term investments in our relationships with these nations. I'll tell you, these partner nations are, my military term I use them as they're gamers. Right, we have operational units that will do stuff with very high risk profiles. I was watching some Mexican Marines fast rope off a helicopter onto a go fast doing 30 knots a few weeks back. That's varsity level operational integration. And I have you remember my bio a little bit. Like many people from my generation, I spent a lot of time in the deserts and grew up in the counterinsurgency and counterterrorism fights. Where the U.S. military has really evolved a lot of advanced targeting techniques, things like that. I will tell you that the operational integration I see at JIATF at an operational level, at a tactical level, is some of the finest I've seen ever. Our ability to have trade-offs between a source of intelligence all the way to an interdiction on the water, that might touch 5, 6, 10 different organizations, nations. It might be an aircraft that has to track it and then has to turn it over to another nation's aircraft. That person then might have to, or that organization then might have to turn it over to another nation. And there are interdictions where we'll have 10 or 11 different handoffs. Every one of those is a standard operating procedure, is a common language of understanding it. It's the operational independence is just phenomenal with our partner nations. And it's also just, it's a lot of fun to be in an environment where we have these best and brightest from these nations working with us side by side. It's a really rich experience too.
I know IUU fishing is not part of your mandate or your purview, but I do know that it's, you mentioned working with partner nations. I believe it's the Navy, or it could be the Coast Guard, you would know better, is supporting navies in South America that are facing foreign fishing fleets that are basically, fishing illegally and cleaning out the fish, particularly along the coast of Argentina. Can you talk a little bit about IUU fishing and what the U.S. is doing, what the U.S. Navy, what the U.S. Coast Guard, whichever is the appropriate agency, is doing to strengthen the ability of partners to go after IUU fishing?
Yeah, and well, you kind of hit into where I talked about, what we have at JIATF is a place where alignment of interest happens, right? So, for example, Chile is a great example. They care a great deal about IUFF fishing. They have a very capable Navy. They have a massive responsibility of ocean, and they care about that. But the great things about ships, particularly ocean-going ships, is they can do more than one thing at once, right? And that's very unique. We naval officers all understand this. So I can have a U.S. Coast Guard ship that is on an IUFF mission, but they will also be in a tether. And if they see some nefarious activity, we have the ability to call them up and say, hey, can you go take a look at this? Once again, when we want to be able to help the nations with what they care about. And IUFF fishing is a real deal. But it's very maritime in its nature, and our business is very maritime in nature as well, so there's significant overlap.
We also mentioned, I think you touched upon at one point, containers. Much of the cocaine that we've seen in our work going to Europe is primarily on commercial containers. Yeah. You're able to hide much greater volumes, and because of the way containers work, it's a commercial activity. It's more difficult to interdict. It requires different kinds of law enforcement agencies. What can you tell me about drug trafficking through the Caribbean to Europe or to the United States on containers? And perhaps what the U.S. generally is doing about that.
That's great, and I will say the U.S. and other international organizations as well. So containers kind of gets to the bread and butter of what actually how the globalization actually happens, right? Things travel all over the world in containers. A container ship will pull into a port with or a ship will pull in with thousands of containers. Every one of them has a different bill of lading, has a different origin, has a different destination. There's plenty of room for abuses in that. Now we live in the modern digital age. So one of our tools for that is the more we digitize in ports, and that's the enterprise, that's all of us, that gives us the ability to find anomalies, right? So if, no different than when you're clicking on your Amazon order to see when it's going to come. That's causing a ping to go somewhere. Hey, where's my package, right? That's anomalous to how commodities are tracked at sea. So we have the ability to aggregate data in some cases when it's available and look for things that don't make sense, okay? Now, that relies to a great degree on the commercialization or the professionalization of the ports. And so there's some wonderful regimes that are out there, constant process of incremental improvements in the professionalism of ports. For example, I was in a port in Guyana, Sherman, I can't remember recently, where I was looking at the scanners. None of them worked. Okay, I asked this wonderful woman in charge of the security screening for the employees there. I said, "How do you actually do background checks?" And upon really questioning well, we don't, because no one wants to. If we hire felons, we can pay them less. Okay. That said, if you look at some of the kind of the checklist items of there's the Coast Guard has program International Shipping. Oh boy, it's called ISPIS. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the name of it, but it has to do with professionalism of ports, where you have security boundaries, where you have layered defenses, things like that. These are the type of incremental improvements that help. A very effective program is one that UNODC runs, a container program, where they'll come in and they'll do training and they'll help ports increase their professionalism, so that you can, your words as the author of Bridges and Barriers, so you can enhance or you can put more barriers, and at least you got to make them work harder to get stuff on a container, right? Yeah. But it's a big. You can send a lot of drugs in containers, and we've intercepted quite a few very large loads. When you intercept a container, you're not getting hundreds of pounds. You're getting metric tons of cocaine.
Yeah, I think we have a visualization of one of the containers from our digital report showing ironically, bananas, which seems to be one of the major
Right.
commodities that cocaine is concealed in, particularly out of Ecuador.
Well, and I'll explain why that is. This is important too. If you are a nation that is in compliance with ISPIS procedures and protocols, generally in our globalized world with just-in-time inventories, your ship gets front of the line, your container gets front of the line, right? Well, by its very nature, perishable fruits, for example, they have to be front of the line or the cargo goes bad. So that's why there's such a ripe kind of
No
bad.
pun intended.
No pun intended. Really none. I'm a nuclear engineer. I have no humor. But yeah, that was those tend to get front of the line. That's why they're good targets for putting things in.
Right.
Yep.
Admiral, as you finish your tour at JIATF, and your career with the Navy, what recommendations, looking back, would you have for U.S. policymakers, particularly about illicit narcotics trafficking?
Sure, thanks for that question, because I have lots of thoughts on this. For one, I think we really need to recognize that this is a wicked problem, okay? Now, a wicked problem does not lend itself to an easy solution by definition. It's multivariate. Once you think you're heading one direction, you have to head in a different direction. And this is really a wicked problem. And that means you have to recognize that you have to have an agile organization and lots of structures that can get after parts of this problem. Okay, I would say that you asked me what advice I could give the policymakers. For one is there's a great document that our government has put out, the National Security Presidential Memorandum 7. Okay, and what this is this is a document that that says we need to all work together in the interagency to get after transnational organized criminals. We need to have a common frame of reference. We need to share databases. There's a fundamental recognition that I might have something in a database that I can't share with you, right? Say you have to go to court. We might not want to have this information available because it gives away some exquisite national capability. Or vice versa, I might want to know, if you're a law enforcement agent, I might want to know everything I can about your case, but some of it's very sensitive because you've developed a relationship or it's a confidential informant. There's sensitive things that have to be shared, right? The beautiful thing about databases is you can segregate information, okay? So what NSPM 7, it's a mandate to U.S. government institutions to basically recognize there's firewalls between what you can share, but default to sharing and find a way to work through those. Now, you asked me, the first question is, what's kind of changed? What's the structures of JIATF as an interagency organization? 10 years ago, I would say that the interagency element was often cemented by a handshake, was cemented by a relationship, and people working together. Moving forward, more and more, we have to find ways to make sure those same handshakes and that same trust goes across the data realm, right? I would like you to have 80% of the information that my military has because that helps you, say, Drug Enforcement Agency or FBI. That helps your case. And I'd like to have maybe 80%, but I recognize you can't have some of this, and I recognize that I can't have some of that, but that's okay because when we put those together and then we use the wonderful modern tools we have available, which is, as we head toward AI and ML worlds, which we run down there in JIATF, the correlations, the case information that you can put together to effectively get after this massive transnational global problem, you develop a lot of tools there. And that kind of gets to the theme I've been hitting on, which is networks fight networks. Networks also have to be able to communicate to each other at a meaningful way, and that's going to be at the ones and zeros level. I think one other final thing I would say is there's a real focus on a single commodity at times, and I see this all the time with fentanyl right now. If we beat fentanyl, the next thing will be just as bad, right? We have to focus on the networks. You can't chase a single commodity. That's something that my time at JIATF has really taught me. And then I guess finally for policymakers, I got a chance to go to Harvard, like I said, right? So one of my academic advisors there was my academic hero, a guy named Joe Nye. And Professor Nye has this classic definition of what constitutes a national security threat. A national security threat is that which affects the average American on the average day. That's what we do at JIATF, right? Yeah. And so we have many visitors who come through there who ask lots of questions about how we can get after this. How does this interagency work? I'm having constant dialogue with members of Congress, with lots of generals and admirals who also want to figure out how this stuff works down here. But probably the most challenging group I asked that really asked hard, pointed questions was about a month ago, and it was a group of educators from across our country. And they care. They want to know, what are you doing to make our streets clean and take care of our safety?
In our schools.
In our schools, right. So it was fascinating. I mean, those teachers took me to town, and rightly so. It was a form of accountability. So I would say that this is not a threat from another state actor. This is from something in our hemisphere, and we need to take it really seriously. And we're doing good work with it, but we can't take our eye off it.
Admiral LeGree, thank you so much for speaking with us today. We really appreciate your insights.
Sure.